Lihe, South Mountain. South Mountain, so full of sorrow. Its ghostly rain spattering the lonely grass. In Chang'an, this autumn midnight, how many men have grown old in your winds? Dim and uncertain are these footpaths in the yellow dusk, writhing upward the dark oaks along the way. When the moon is high, the trees have no shadows. Over the entire mountain, a white dawn. Dulled torches welcome the newly arrived, as fireflies swirl over these lonely tombs. Okay, so here we have another poem of Lihe. We're jumping back, not in time, but to the poems produced by Lihe. And I think this poem, South Mountain, is very representative of his style, probably the most representative of his style. You will remember that Lihe had a pretty unhappy and short life and was pretty unsuccessful in his attempts at becoming a scholar official, and he tended to brood and to write poems on dark, unlucky topics, at least from the point of view of a standard scholar official. And this poem shows this very well. Li was known as the Shigui, as the ghost of poetry. And the poem that we have read today, South Mountain, which is actually part of a group called Gangfeng Wushou, moved to satirize 5 poems. It's number 3 in the series, and it's a poem about a cemetery. This South Mountain that begins the poem is a site of many graveyards during the Tang. So you must imagine it as a charnel place. Cemeteries in ancient times were not as clean or as sanitized as current day cemeteries. Cremation took place in these cemeteries. If they followed Buddhist rituals, it was not unusual for bits of human beings to be lying around, or even for recently deceased bodies to, be in the place. I imagine in a place like Chang'an, with more than 1 million inhabitants at this time, there would have been a lot of corpses being produced. In fact, cemeteries were places that obviously were unliked. They were visited at certain rituals, for example, the Qingming festival, and you try to clean up and have your tombs well in order. Buddhists, especially some Buddhist monks, did some ascetic practices in cemeteries. But anyway, this is a poem about a cemetery, about a real or imagined visit by Lihe to a cemetery on the outskirts of the capital. And that makes it unusual. I haven't read any other poem by a scholar official of the Tang about a cemetery, about visiting a cemetery, although you could say that the general topic that is developed is pretty conventional. So this is a landscape poem, although the landscape is, as we say, a graveyard. And the feelings depicted, like sadness and melancholy in autumn and premonitions of death and that sort of thing, that's pretty common. But in another sort of a landscape, just a neutral autumn landscape with perhaps a parting topic as well developed in the poem. So that's the topic. Visiting a cemetery, real or imagined visit, and the feelings of sadness that landscape produces on the poetic persona. Also the thoughts about death, about impermanence, about the loneliness of the departed, of the dead in their tombs. And yeah, that's it. Generally, the poem is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 5. It's a bit weird in metrical form. It looks like pentasyllabic lines. Yeah, but you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have 10 pentasyllabic lines. So this would be probably an old style poem. Yeah, it fits the model of an old style poem. And it has a total of 5 couplets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 couplets. So as usual, let's take a look and dissect the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. South Mountain, so full of sorrow, its ghostly rain spattering the lonely grass. So as usual, the first poem puts us in place, but also puts us in situation and touches or presses the emotional mood, the emotional key So the poem begins, South Mountain, so the famous graveyard, so full of sorrow. The cemetery already would evoke by itself sorrow and melancholy, but the poet clearly tells us this place is infused with sadness, and therefore the poem that is going to continue is going to describe, is going to depict that sadness. And the second line of the couplet presents us an image of that sadness. It's ghostly rain spattering the lonely grass. So it's raining. Rain is usually very representative of sadness, of tears, like heavenly tears. It's a ghostly rain, because it's a rain in the cemetery, a place of ghosts and dead bodies. And it's spattering the lonely grass. So we have here a very typical personification, the grass depicted as lonely, even though, grass is an insentient being. But it does make sense. Not only is the poet extrapolating his feelings into nature, I mean, the grass is objectively lonely from the point of view that the cemetery is perhaps not that much visited, except perhaps in times like Qingming or in the summer. This is autumn, which we will learn about in the next couplet. So it's the melancholy, sad season, the depressive season of thinking about death and decline, but it's also a season when cemeteries perhaps are less visited than at other times of the year. So the grass really is lonely in a way. It's not just acting as a vessel for the poet's thoughts and feelings. Second couplet. In Chang'an, this autumn midnight, how many men have grown old in your winds? So the second couplet is a rhetorical question, and we are still in South Mountain. We know now season of the year and time of day, and both are typically associated with decline, with darkness. It's autumn, which, as we've said in many other commentaries to other poems, is the season of sadness and melancholy in Chinese poetry. Winter also, but winter is worse, but winter generally does not get depicted that much in poems. So autumn is like the declining season. And it's midnight, so it's late, there's nobody here, it's dark probably, or relatively dark. There is a contrast between light and darkness in the poem, which we will comment in the following couplets. But anyway, the poetic persona is imagined to be at the cemetery. He looks back to Chang'an, the capital, and he makes a thought. How many people in the capital are growing old in your winds? The winds from this cemetery, from this South Mountain, are believed or are imagined by the poet to bring people closer to death. Like this charnel place is not only the abode of the dead, it attracts, it brings people closer to itself and therefore to death. Third couplet. Dim and uncertain are these footpaths in the yellow dusk, writhing upward, the dark oaks along the way. So this couplet depicts the darkness. Well, it's midnight, if we are to believe the previous couplet. Or perhaps it's not yet midnight, but the poet is thinking about how the midnight will feel in the capital when the winds from the charnel place reach it. But anyway, now it seems to be dusk, so it's not yet midnight, can't be midnight. And or perhaps the poet is remembering the dusk when he was walking towards the cemetery before arriving at it. And that reminiscence of the previous path, again, is a depiction of nature, of landscape, but slightly ominous in the images. Like the footpaths are difficult to see while the sun is setting. They are dim and uncertain, and upward writhing are the dark oaks along the way. So we get a picture. There's this winding path that takes you to South Mountain, and which is becoming indistinct in the dusk when the poet was climbing the mountain. There's these trees going up, dark, brooding trees. They're images of the landscape, but they're also, the lack of sight through the path. It can act as a metaphor for impending death. The path, that is life, is becoming indistinct, is uncertain. So perspectives for the future are dim. The path is always a metaphor for life. And dark oaks rise along the way. Also very good parallelistic couplet. If you can see, there is a contrast. There's two images of movement. probably you could say a horizontal one of the moving path, winding and disappearing, and the dark oaks, that's a vertical one. And although they're not disappearing, they're dark, so they emphasize this darkness, this broodiness. And okay, so next couplet, which is the fourth couplet, I think. When the moon is high, the trees have no shadows. Over the entire mountain, a white dawn. This is, at least from the comment in the place where I'm getting the translation from, the Biographical Dictionary of Tang Dynasty Literati by William Nienhauser. This biography having been written by whom? Can't find the author here. Anyway, yeah, here by William Nienhauser himself and Michael Fischlen. So this couplet is supposed to be the most unusual one in the whole poem, or the most striking one, because it's, in the translation we have, when the moon is high, the trees have no shadows. But this moon being high is literally midday or noon moon. So Li He is in a way depicting this scene that was dark, brooding with the cemetery, and now the moon is out, and it's like a supernatural and weird sun has come out. Like it's the moon, it's not the sun, but you have this moon, which makes the trees lose their shadows. The moon is directly overhead, and the mountainscape result in a mountainscape so white it seems to be broad daylight. So you have a reverse chiaroscuro effect enhancing the ghostly effect of the scene, or so say the critics. So very Li He, this weird, supernatural, ghostly scene. Like we had all these images of darkness in the cemetery, and in this couplet we get a sort of an inversion. The moon is shining in the sky, bathing everything in whiteness, eliminating shadows as if it were the sun, but it's not the sun, it's the moon. And this is a nightly, deathly, ghostly landscape. So it's like a white dawn under the moon. Finally, the last couplet pulls us back again into the darkness. Dulled torches welcome the newly arrived, as fireflies swirl over these lonely tombs. The cemetery is abandoned. Again, we have lonely tombs like we had lonely grass in the first couplet. So this final scene depicts a return to darkness. There are torches, but they're dulled. Maybe they've run out, or maybe because of the materials of the torches, which were probably red and black lacquered torch holders, they absorb the light. So you have this return to the darkness, which is welcoming the newly arrived, the dead, or the poetic persona who has figuratively, as it were, or literally arrived at the cemetery. Who's there apart from the tombstones? There is no living being, only fireflies. So fireflies with their tiny lights, with their tiny pinpoints of light, with their diminished light, are the only company of the deceased and of the poet. So it's a quite interesting image, a very pictorial, very visual image of this darkness in the cemetery with the little fireflies buzzing around and emitting their tiny pinpoints of light. So, nice poem. I quite like it. It feels, very fin de siècle, very decadentist. This is not a poem Baudelaire could write. And, yeah, I think it's also very good because it really depicts very well Li He's very peculiar style.